Welcome to Cashman's Garage. I'm Justin, and today we're going to be working on an '05 Buick LeSabre. Now, after a little bit of research and a little bit of diagnosis here, we learned that the starter has stopped working. Tested the battery, tested the relays. Next step is to pull this starter out. First step is to get this thing up in the air. Looks like it's up in the front by the AC compressor. Should be nothing to it. Let's get started. So as you can see here, there is no access from under the hood. So we're going to have to go underneath the vehicle to remove this. You're going to have to go past your skid plate that I took off, not realizing that our starter is actually all the way in the back here, right by our AC compressor. Looks like it's fairly accessible. I think as long as you're under here, check your grounds, make sure everything looks nice and tight. But our first real step here is going to be to remove this black cover. Looks like we have a push pin connector, a couple bolts, and one final bolt here, right here. So yeah, we're going to take all those off. We're going to remove our connections from the starter up here, and hopefully we can get this thing out. So as you can see here, that plate, skid plate, whatever you want to call it, cover, actually came off in two pieces. Now I guess in theory, if you wanted to, you could just remove the ones that kind of cover your starter bolts, but by taking it off, you can actually take a look at the flywheel, make sure that the teeth are in good shape, because you know, if your teeth are all ground off on the flywheel, your car's not going to start either. So all part of the diagnosis process. And yeah, from down here it looks like there really isn't a whole lot to it. We got a couple mounting bolts, and then you got all your stuff on the top, your positive cable, your switch. Now I would recommend disconnect the battery before doing this. I've replaced many starters, and on a few, without removing your battery cables from the battery, if you're taking off that positive wire and you knock your wrench into a piece of ground, it'll kind of spark and it'll wake you up pretty good. So that's going to be our next step. We're going to disconnect the battery. We're going to disconnect all of our little cables up here, and it is pretty straightforward. Just remember what you took off, and make sure to put it back in the same place when you get your new starter. Now my goal is to actually take the starter off, and I am going to bring it to a local shop and have them bench test it just to reconfirm, and that's where I'm going from here. Accessing the battery is quite simple. You go back seat, passenger side, give that a good yank. You got your battery here. Now, when I disconnect the battery, I usually just disconnect the negative terminal. That's all that's really necessary. And that's going to be your black one here. And it's an 8mm nut. Now, I'm not going to show putting this thing back on later, but keep in mind, these battery posts are lead, and they like to strip out very easily, so you don't need to crank this down when you're putting it back. So now we're going to remove the starter. So I pulled the starter out, really nothing to it, just a couple bolts, short guy, long guy, and two nuts. Each holds a wire. It slips right out, assuming you took everything out of the way there. So now I'm kind of testing this thing out. I got my jumper pack, connected the negative to the small terminal, positive to the big terminal, and now I'm going to attempt to jump this, and this is going to eliminate any ground wires, potential ignition faults. In theory, if this starter was still good, it should kick right over. But no, we're getting the same problem that we were getting before, where it just clicks. The starter kicks out but does not engage. So Now that we figured this out, I think it's pretty safe to put this starter back in. Well, not this one. We're going to grab a new one, put it back in, and fire her up. So we're putting the starter back in. Really nothing to it. You have your 2 bolts, and you're going to want to reconnect your 2 wires up in the top here. And from there, we're going to take this thing and test it out, and we should be good to go. Now, I'll usually try to crank this thing over before I even put these plates back on. But again, make sure everything's hooked up correctly before putting this battery back on. So let's see what happens. Our new starter is back in. I just got to put the plates back on, but I want to make sure that this starter cranks over before we do anything else here. And look at that. We're alive. Sounds like we have a little bit of a misfire, but that's going to be for the next project. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you on the next one.